How to beat scam.
Next on Eternal Dirtles.
Hey, I just want to give a quick shout out to all of our Patreon supporters out there. Thank you to the Dirtle Maniacs. If you want to be a Dirtle Maniac, go to patreon.com/eternaldurtles and help support the channel. It keeps things going. It keeps things updated. Thanks so much for watching. On with the show. Hello and welcome to Eternal Dirtles. I'm your host, Zach Clark, and with me as always, Phil Blackman. Phil, this is your last episode before, 45-day hiatus?
Wow. Yeah, this will be my last episode before I go on tour with my show, or rather I'm going to go into rehearsals and then go on tour with my show. It's called The Last Match. Get your tickets if you're on the Eastern Seaboard. Links below. And my closing date for that show is May 18th in Atlanta. And then after that, I fly back, and then we'll be all back to norm ski on the pod ski.
This episode is brought to you by Tales of Adventure. Go to toamagic.com and use the code DIRTLES for 5% off your order. You'll be directly supporting the show, and you'll get the entire order in one package. No more waiting for several packages. That's toamagic.com, code DIRTLES for 5% off. You guys are just closing it down 44 years to the date after Mount St. Helens erupted. Wow. That is a wild choice.
We totally planned it too. So people don't talk about it enough, you know.
No, it's not in the popular mind's eye. You got to bring it back.
back.
So, Phil, today we're going to talk about how to beat scam. Yep. So I played it in a 1K over the weekend, and I played against it 3 times in the 1K. And no value judgment there. I think that it's a popular deck and people should be playing it if they can. I think it's one of the better decks in the format right now. And whether or not I think that these are fun cards to play against, we live in a reality that exists with these cards. So we have to figure out ways to beat this deck, right? Mm-hmm. And I think I've kind of stumbled upon something for myself as an 8-cast player. I pivoted over to 8-cast because I didn't have time to borrow duels from people. It turns out my buddy Jeremy was there. The guy I borrowed the duels off of for Eternal Weekend. I could have just hit him up and asked him, but anyhow, I decided to play 8-cast because I thought a Chalice of the Void deck in this particular meta was a good choice. And I think I was ultimately correct, although I did not top 8 this tournament. I went 2-1. Mm-hmm. But and that has to do with something I was actually explaining to Dukes and Stress. Their episode's coming up on Thursday. I think this will drop Tuesday. Is how you and I still kind of play like what I call old man magic, and that's not so much that we're playing we're stagnant in our thoughts, but we are still trying to play Magic like it's 2019. And you're playing a deck that hasn't been good since at least 2019.
I was getting buried by Teferi and Narset in 2019. Back it up a little further. I'm Grandpa Magic over here.
Fair. Well, what I'm saying is now that I'm getting out, physically going out to play, and I'm playing online, I'm starting to get my reps back up, and it's not theory anymore. We're going into the lab and we're experimenting, right? We're doing the work. So I think with that, one of the things that I've sort of noticed is that once you get out there and you start playing and you get the reps in, you have to relearn the heuristics, right? A classic example is I was playing at Scam in round 4, and I decided that it would be smart to go to 1 life. I was playing a Phyrexia Metamorph, and I was like, I need to keep a mana up just in case they reanimate something for my spell bomb. So I need this blue mana. I'll go to 1 life. And then my opponent just flashed into Orcish Bowmasters. And I'm like, if I had been playing the game since Baltimore last year was the first time that that card had seen play, right? If I had been playing the game regularly, weekly, since Baltimore, I never would have made a mistake like that. So the number one way to beat Scam is to know your deck and know the format, right? I lost because I wasn't paying attention to the obvious card. Obvious card kills you, right? But I think beyond that, I think a Chalice of the Void deck is the way to go right now. Just because stopping their Brainstorm, Ponder, Reanimate shenanigans just bricks a large part of their deck. And if they're double scamming you on the first turn, you still have access to Emery. So they have to take your Emery or your hate piece. If you follow up with your with your Emery later on and get your hate piece back, that grief didn't mean much to them. So I think it's interesting to be able to sort of look at the way scam works and to sort of dissect it. Is like, okay, if you're going to destroy my hand, I'll play a level of redundancy that doesn't allow you to do that.
Yeah, I know that you just said we should probably like we're done with theory. I actually think it might be a worthwhile experiment for people, or a worthwhile exercise for people who are still having trouble combating scam, to actually break down scam on the axis at which they can beat you and which they do beat you. Similar to
Yeah.
like when we've talked about axis for other decks and how you can beat them. My favorite one, just because it's so clear, is old A&T decks had tutor chains, they had ad nauseum tendrils, or ad nauseum. They had ad nauseum itself, an ad nauseum line, or they had a past in flames line. And so those were their main three axes of being able to kill you. And then post board, they would have things like chain of vapor loops on their artifacts or whatever to build storm. But for the most part, they had three axes of which they could kill you on. And if you had tools to cut off or bottleneck one of those axes, it limited them to where they could only get down one of the other axes in order to kill you. And that means that you were able to line up your other permission against those axes if you understood how the matchup worked. And that could be really useful as a way to like make card choices, how to navigate a game based on those card choices of which axes you're bottlenecking, how to mulligan if you find out multiple pieces on the same axis and that's not enough, or if you can distribute how you want to line up your cards, et cetera, et cetera. So for scam, this is where like scam, I have been able to identify the three axes at which I die most to them, and tell me if you agree with this. And then from there we'll be able to
Please.
we'll be able to point out why your experiment so far with 8cast has been fruitful, because 8cast just incidentally also slots in at being able to punish those axes in meaningful ways. So what my understanding, at least in my experience so far playing against scam, is there's three different major axes that matter to get out of the early game. That is,
Yeah.
they can do literal scam you, which is grief reanimate on turn 0 or turn 1, depending on whether or not you want to.
On the play, I'm gonna say double grief reanimate.
Right, exactly. So it's they have the scam line, they have entomb reanimate for whatever their fatties of choice are line, so they can reanimate you, so they can scam you, they can reanimate you, or they can daze wasteland you on permission and then play like that pseudo control roll before they stick a better haymaker, whether that be setting up the reanimate line or setting up a Murktide or what have you. But like it's mana denial, scamming you, or reanimating you. Those are the three axes at which I find that I lose those games. And knowing how your tools are supposed to line up against those axes. Now, of course, if a game develops, there's more play. They're not an all-in combo deck in any of that regard, the way that like the ad nauseum tendril line is, where it's like they have to storm you to kill you. They can just stick a Murktide in a developed game and protect it and kill you because Murktide's too powerful, blah, 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 blah. But if you get to that point, then some amount of game has to have happened. And so in my POV, those are the three axes that we should really look at when picking card choices, picking decks, et cetera, et cetera. So your example of Emery and Chalice, in that regard, okay, Chalice is really good because they can't entomb reanimate if you have a Chalice on one, right? Okay, so we're fighting over that portion, which is you can't reanimate entomb me. And part of that means that if you're on the play and you get to stick that Chalice, then they also can't scam you. Now they can grief you, but they can't reanimate the scam. So you're cutting off 1.5 lines on a Chalice. So Chalice, in that regard, good. Now, if you're on the draw and they scam you, we've talked about this in previous episodes where grief existing and being a turn 0 play, and then the scam play pattern, meaning that if they strip your most meaningful tool and then leave your hand with nothing, you are compelled to make choices in your deck that make you more redundant. You just have to be more redundant to fight on that axis. And then similarly with Dave's Wasteland, that package just requires you to compress your curve. So we have to have a compressed curve, we have to be redundant, and then we're looking for ways to combat the third axis that they have. In this particular instance, you have just naturally stumbled into Chalice and Emery do a lot of that action, right? If they scam you, well, now they're looking at multiple Chalices, even though they look like two different cards, right? So they have to take one and hopefully buy time. Maybe they have the removal spell for the Emery, maybe they don't, but like now you are better set up against getting scammed. If you have a Chalice on one, they can't both entomb and reanimate you before you can stick a Chalice if they haven't griefed you. So they can entomb on one, but if you stick that Chalice, they can respond to it by entombing, but then they can't reanimate it. They would need to animate dead it, and that limits their options, right? Instead of having 8 reanimation spells, they have 4 reanimation spells, and hopefully you can line up a force or something else to not die in that way. And then
I think one of the interesting parts of that too is that if you do stop the entomb, the only way that they have to get cards into the graveyard beyond like a very easy to answer troll is they have to like brainstorm, fetch, surveil like their fatty into the yard. They only play 2 fatties. They play Archon and they play Atraxa. They only play 2, so it's not very likely that they're going to get a chance to do that against you.
Yeah, now there is something to be said about like the deck is very good because there are naturally some lines where a bunch of those axes intersect where if they're on the die roll, there isn't a hand that beats them. So, for example, if they if they grief you and they take your major piece or whatever, and then you try and stick something, and then they also just get to go, okay, end step, entomb, daze your play, untap, reanimate. It's like, okay, if you didn't also have 4 pieces of interaction there, like no hand is getting you out of that position. So like we have to like remove those positions from the equation, right? But that's also why the deck is very good, because just having multiple black cards and a daze in their hand isn't asking for all that much. It's why the deck is very good. But
well, one of the things that happened against them, and this is why I kind of wanted to do this episode, was the very first play of the game. I happened to be on the play, which was wonderful. And I looked at my hand and I realized, okay, I have Emery, Hearse, Unlicensed Hearse, and some number of mana sources and artifacts. And I'm like, okay, well, this is a keep, I guess, in the blind. I don't know what my opponent's playing, but like these are all fine Magic cards. I start the game off knowing that like I'm gonna be able to play Hearse on turn 2. I can't play it on turn 1. So I start off by going Emery on turn 1 with a couple of baubles or whatever. My opponent forces it, and I'm like, whoa, whatever. They're on a blue deck, right? They untap, grief me, take my Hearse. Wow, rough, right? They don't reanimate, luckily, right? I go to my next turn. Oh, I top decked an Emery. I have 4 of them in the deck. Slam the Emery, and they were like, pretty good. So sometimes you can just outdraw the discard deck. Like, discard's great until you draw the thing, right? They can't stop you from getting the answer.
I think that example is you built the deck that was hyper redundant on the axes that matter, and then all of a sudden, like your opponent goes, "Wow, pretty good." And you're like, "I am doing this because you playing the top deck right now is compelling me to make this kind of choice."
Yeah.
So,
well, yeah, I mean, they weren't like upset at all. They were like, "Yep, that's exactly what I expected to happen." Yeah. You know, like and that was the fear they had.
Yeah, and to further to that point, if we think about the axis of trying to cut off the reanimation line, Chalice does that on Entomb Reanimate. But that's a turn 0 or that's a turn 1 play with a soul land, right? You Ancient Tomb out your Chalice. But similarly, if you look at Hearse, also fighting in the same realm that Chalice is in the matchup, then you're thinking that's also an ideally or potentially turn 1 play that cuts off the axis of being able to reanimate you. And that one actually is cutting them off because they can't reanimate and entomb either, or they can't reanimate or animate dead either, because Hearse will just cut off whatever they choose. So in the matchup in particular, then that Chalice could cut off the cantrips and blah blah blah. But for the axes that I would look at Chalice in your deck and Hearse in your deck is those 2 things. It's like if you opened a Chalice and a Hearse, you're like, well, these are both fighting on the same line. Do I need to? If they take one, I can cut that off, but then I'm still. I would be soft if they have scam on turn 0. Whereas like if you have another line of like your own threat or what have you to like fight on the other axes of like if you stick something fast, you know, that they can't get over. I know that a lot of 8-cast deck have been on patchwork. So if you're like on 8-cast plus baubles and it's like, well, they have to take the piece that stops them. But then if you're like, okay, I'm just going to take a super aggressive line because I'm forced into it now. But like being able to go, this is what this card does on the axis that matters, as opposed to going, this is graveyard hate. This is 1-drop hate. You know, like zoning in on what those tools actually mean for you is how I would approach anybody who's building their deck right now trying to combat scam.
I think another important piece of the puzzle, Phil, is the 4D chess that happens on games 2 and 3, right? So this is what I've learned over these 3 matches, right? So spoiler alert, I didn't crush against this deck every time I played it in the tournament. I went 2-0, I went 1-1-1, and I went 0-2, right? But I learned a lot. Like, what's the Sun Tzu? When you lose, don't lose the lesson, or maybe that's Confucius. I'm not sure. But when you lose, don't lose the lesson, right? So what I learned after each of these matches, because I had a little bit of time to sit down and talk with my opponents, is that oftentimes when they see hate, when they realize you're like this is a guy who's playing main deck Soul Guide's Lantern, right? They're siding out some number of the reanimation package, especially if they got Chaliced out in game one. The reanimates go, Atraxa and Archon go, and they bring in other cards. They become a more fair deck. They bring in their Murktides and stuff like that, right? And what I realize is that if I'm bringing in sideboard cards against a plan that's not now no longer happening, that's the same as getting scammed, right? Like I just gave up 2 or 3 cards from my deck. 1 or 2 might have been in my opener. I might have mold to them, right? If that's the case, I have to be doing that 4D chess in my head too, and determining whether or not I think that what I already have main deck, which is Spellbomb, I would consider a hate piece. Soul Guide Lantern and the Hearse are all main deck like hate cards for, against the deck, right? If those are good enough to begin with, and I can just say, hey, in a long-term fair versus fair game where every one of my cards is relevant, I can beat this deck.
Mhm.
Now, not everyone's going to be on that 4D chess. You might 4D chess yourself out of a game where your opponent just goes in like turn 2, Atraxas you, right? This is why I'm playing one Phyrexian Metamorph. Because I'll put a Phyrexian Metamorph into play too. Or sorry, I'll put an Atraxa into play too.
Yeah, I want to just note that, like, because I understand what you're saying, and I think you're correct. I just want to simplify and like actually define what 4D chess means, or at least how I'm interpreting when you say 4D chess. When the playing the 4D chess of like what they're taking in, or what plan are they moving in and out of, I'm thinking a way that's been useful for me in simplifying what that means is they're looking at what axes to fight on are the most relevant for them, that are likely to be the most successful. And so when they're like, okay, I'm going to board out my graveyard stuff because they have all this hate, and then move into whatever the alt plan is. Now it's like, okay, post board, what are you expecting their 3 potential axes to fight on that they can be? They're obviously still going to be able to Daze Wasteland you. They obviously are going to be able to grief you still. And then is their package like more Dothy Voidwalkers? So they're essentially just like unblockable Protect the Queens.
They go more Voidwalker, more Murktide, because then like I can't, like I'm a ground deck for the most part. I can't really even block those things.
And then, but like, right, they're essentially playing evasion deck, and they're playing more to the board as opposed to out of the graveyard. But Murktide still suffers from graveyard hate if you are checking it the way that Hearse does.
Yep. If you're doing it right.
But like all of their threats after post board, if they fear Chalice, is they can also just like not run into Chalice, right? They can move more into their 2-drop threats between Dothy Voidwalker and Bowmaster or Murktide. They can play through the Chalice by just chucking a bunch of spells into the Chalice, so that way they can Murktide. Like I think that when you say 4D chess, it is useful to just think they're moving away from the graveyard axis and moving into insert whatever axis you believe that they are moving into, given the meta at that moment.
Blue-black mid-range, basically.
And then thinking, okay, what is the tool to fight on the board if they start going wide with, just effectively they become blue-black hate bears. And how do I combat blue-black hate bears? What would that look like? And then choosing cards for that post board. And then hopefully there's some amount of crossover, or there's some amount of crossover for other matchups. Now, Phyrexian Metamorph is going to be good in either, because you either copy the Atraxa if they have it, but I mean, the odds that you get to stick it, remains to be seen if they have an Atraxa that flipped over 10 cards. But still, obviously, like if you get to do that, that's awesome. But then vice versa. I mean, I remember a long time ago when Bowmaster first came out and ACAST was starting to dip, and we were talking about how Phyrexian Metamorph was the answer to Bowmaster, because it effectively gives you a Bowmaster to answer their Bowmaster, and that's what
it did.
And that's what matters. So, but like in that regard, again, it's like you found Phyrexian Metamorph as this tool, but like to simplify what it actually looks like on paper, theory wise, you're going, oh, Phyrexian Metamorph is just better on the axis that I need to fight on, because that becomes the pivot. So rather than thinking we're trying to 4D chess each other, if you're like, okay, well, I am presenting the hate for their stuff, so like the onus is on them to make the move away from that axis onto something else, and then you then get to go, how much do I want to concede that they are going to respect that or not? And hopefully you can gauge that by the player, how badly the game won that they got blown out by, how much they expect to be put on. Like if you show them Hearse and Soul Guide Lantern in game one, they'll be like, there's no way that this is going to be effective because this is freebies, right? If they see a Soul Guide Lantern as a freebie in there, they might move away from it anyway. But I think simplifying what 4D chess is as to like, yeah, we're playing a level up game, blah, 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 blah. But really, it's just what axes are going to get me there? What axes are they pivoting into? What axes can I actually compete on with what my deck allows me, given your color combination and the tools available to you?
Yeah. Well, I think also it's worth thinking about like beyond what axis is happening there. Like if you break down that deck, right, against a Delver deck, it's pretty good. Against a combo deck, you've got the disruption. But if you're playing like Maverick or you're playing like 8-cast, playing a quote unquote fair deck goblins,
Goblins is not a fair deck.
Like
Come on,
a deck, but a deck that is playing like basically decks that would normally just ruin a Delver deck, right? Like all those style of decks, actually do pretty well against this deck because they don't care so much about the Day's Wasteland plan, right? Like I don't care if you wasteland my Ancient Tomb. I've probably gotten the value out of the Ancient Tomb as soon as I played it, right? Like I already skipped ahead a turn, right?
I mean, my experience is that anybody who I know who is on Goblins tells me that Wasteland is one of the best tools against them because they're playing a bunch of 4 and 6 mana chunkers that if you Wasteland them and set them back a turn, they are at the mercy of their top deck, and like that can be pretty bad. Like
so maybe Goblins wasn't a great example.
I know what you're saying though. Like yes, the linear aggro decks that are not playing effective disruption against something that can just that can go under them.
If you can flood the zone against this deck, like as long as you have a way to answer Atraxa, because if you're Goblins and they play Atraxa, you're going to be in trouble, right? But as long as you have a way to deal with Atraxa or stop Atraxa from happening, right? Swords to Plowshares is a great example for Maverick, right? Or Leyline Binding, as long as you can stop that card, right? You can pretty much run over the deck. Like they're not going to do anything that's that broken. A 5/5 troll off of Animate Dead is good, but it's not that good.
So,
like if you're losing to a 5/5, maybe your plan was screwed up. Like that's the way I look at that. Is like sure they can get you with over the course of 4 turns, kill you with this 5/5, but you have 4 draws, brainstorms, ponders, whatnot to find that card that answers that card.
Yeah,
it's I draw 10 cards or 8 cards or 7 cards or whatever by playing this permanent. That's the hard part.
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree that it's as black and white as like if you lost to a 5/5, then like maybe your deck wasn't good enough because practically if they are
just for that.
Yeah, I'm just saying that like the troll is a 6 is functionally unblockable 6/5s that comes down on turn 2 after they have full development. And that is going to be backed by Days, Wasteland, and or counter spells. And you have to assume that if you're an Ancient Tomb deck, it's definitely 3 hits at most. If you are playing a fair deck and assume that you are going to have to like search for an answer or what have you, it is fair to assume that you will have to fetch twice. You are effectively down to 18 without any life gain in the interim. It's effectively 3 hits. So if they're on...
Well, let's not forget that, like, Shadow Spear exists, and sometimes you just get back in the game.
Totally. Yeah. If you have a tool to combat that, the axis of protected unblockable 6/5, cool. Like, of course. I think that, like, a good food for thought as to why Scam right now is the top deck and why the Days Wasteland shells have been the best deck forever is they are the most optimized low to the ground consistent tooled decks, right? And they always have been. Grixis Delver, Rug Delver, whatever flavor of Delver, Days Wasteland plus threats, and Scam is just a variation of that, and they just happen to replace the Delver 1-drops with reanimates.
Delver that pre-flips.
Yeah. So they're just like, okay, we're gonna play the reanimate stuff because it's effectively at the same point on the curve, if not lower. But let's say, so I have learned from the most recent 2K that I played in. I was asking the people who were doing well what they were succeeding with because there was a lot of scam in that room in that recent 2K that I went to. I played against it 4 out of 5 rounds, and I recall when I asked the guys at the top what was overperforming for them, one of the guys who was on Painter had mentioned that he had moved over and played for Leyline of the Void as a way to like get under grief before they could grief them on turn 0. and that they were overperforming. Likewise, I heard that a bunch of Red Stompy players told me that they just had effectively maxed out or at least went to 3 unlicensed hearse in the main as a way to check on the same axis that you were talking about. They were a Chalice
Yep.
unlicensed
And then
hearse.
they have access to Goblin Welder and stuff. Yeah.
So they're effectively an 8 Chalice deck on the axis of cutting off the reanimation spells. And so that was being fruitful for them because it was shortening, and it was cutting off an axis of the deck that wants to fight on early in the game. And so they have to move over to the other axis, and those ones theoretically take a little bit more time to get off the ground. Now, what that means, though, is if and when the people who are playing Scam at the top tables recognize that enough people are respecting a given axis, they can then make the choice to move away from that axis in game one, make those cards look naked so that you then board them out, and then they can board into it post board. So, like, for example, if they
that's the 4D chess of it all right there.
That's also it is 4D chess, but it means that it can hold the mantle as the best deck because they're the ones who have the agency to make that kind of pivot before the meta, because the meta has to respect them because they are the best. So as the best deck, the meta has to warp itself to contend against that best deck. And then that best deck can just make whatever shifts it wants to beat the moves that everybody else made. And then everybody else has to then take that, however long, week long, however long it is, gap to catch back up to the changes that they made. And so forever that play pattern will be that they're the best deck. Maybe they drop off a little bit because people find a solve. You found 8-cast, you found good tools there. But then once they recognize that, they can just make the moves that they want to make. It will then perform better again because it's now fighting on unchallenged axes again. Win a bunch, people will go, holy shit, this deck's too good, and then have to move again. But like it is the thing that is dictating the terms of engagement. And that's what Delver has. Dave's Wasteland threat shell has been forever.
This was the thought process I went into this tournament with when I chose 8-cast, because I was like, everyone's working on hate for Scam. So those artifact slots are now going to be graveyard slots, right? And the Scam deck, the deck that I expect to see the most, and I did, doesn't have a really good artifact sideboard plan, So that was my whole thinking there, was like, there was a point when 8-cast was on top, right? And everyone was like, okay, meltdown, it's time. We're done with this. We're done with this shenanigans, right? And we're at that point where, like, I don't think that 8-cast is going to be the best deck again, but like, we're at that point where like the hate's dropped off just enough that you can safely play that deck in this particular meta. And I think that's one of those things where, like, we can talk about like owning more than one legacy deck as being a way to be good at legacy, because just knowing how to play different decks is going to help you, right? But 2 is being able to pivot when you see those situations come up, right? If I didn't own 8-cast and knew that it was good, I obviously couldn't just pivot to play it, right? I'd have to be still playing Death Shadow or whatever budget deck that I have that I could put together. So it was nice to be able to look at the metagame, be like, because we had that episode where we were talking about Scam in the last maybe 2 episodes ago or an episode ago. We were talking about Scam, and it does seem hopeless, but it just takes a little bit of time to think about, like, okay, like, they're not going to make a ban tomorrow. Like, the best case scenario is like 2 months from now we're going to see a ban. So now we have to work with what we have, right? And one of those things is to do the juke, like, to figure out what this deck does, how do we beat it, what unfair thing can we do to them so that their deck feels fair and our deck feels unfair, right?
Yeah. I think that the only addition that I would make to that is, if you play a deck that is not the best deck, you have to assume that the deck that you are playing is going to potentially only be optimized in the narrow window of the event that you expect to play in. Because if at any point the best deck decides to adapt to beat the tools that are beating it or pivot, they can choose to do so, and you won't know you're behind the curve until you've lost to it. So an example of this is, how easy would it be for Scam to just play a Badlands and then play a bunch of meltdowns in their board if they're like, we really need to target 8-cast?
Very easy.
It'd be very easy. And you'd be like, oh shit, I was not expecting to play against Scam with meltdown. And that was just
Yeah.
the easiest splash they could have ever added. Granted, there's maybe a concession on like a basic or something, but like if they're solving a bunch of problem matchups they expect to face, and then you will be like, oh damn, I now need to be prepared for scam with meltdown. And that's a wholly different pattern. But like
Yeah.
you can't know to do that until they do that, because you can't make the concession of that until you know that it's going to be there. Because if you
And
do,
it
then
has to be
you
worth it for them to do that. Like if they're just going up against me every week at a local, probably not everybody in the metagame changes, right?
right.
But if everybody figures out, everyone watches this episode is like, oh, 8cast is the way to beat scam, and they have success, then there's going to be there's going to be an archetypical shift, you know?
And I think that is, if you are playing a deck that isn't scam, I think that the in addition to everything that we talked about so far on like what axes are you supposed to fight on, it's also only being attached to whatever tools you're using in the narrow window until the top deck shifts. So like being cognizant of what the top tier of the metagame, or that in relation to your deck is doing, in order to combat it. Because like if they make a move and you're unaware of that move, I mean, this is a good useful tool. Why it's helpful to be in like the spaces with the players that are also playing those kinds of decks, where you can get that kind of information to be like, how fast is this information going to travel? Do people believe the adaptations that they're using? What is it likely going to show up in the region of where you're playing in? Is it going to actually develop there? We would probably see a lot faster of that churn online, and then paper follows online. So if you're following what's going on online, you maybe can stay at pace with what's going to happen in paper. But like to not get married to, oh, I solved it, and then they adapt in like a really minute way, like a much smaller adaptation than you had to make to combat them, and then you go,
Yeah.
oh, I just totally got bodied again. What the fuck? What did I miss? And you go, no. I was expecting that shift from them to happen. I am choosing to play not the top deck in order to combat it, because I either like playing this deck or I think it has a good matchup against other stuff I expect to face in my field
Versus what I can afford.
versus what you can afford. But like, it is also fair to say that like,
Yeah.
different regions of the country, different regions in Europe, you just talk to Strass, and Dukes, and who knows what the metagame looks like right now in Australia in paper. So like, where you are is also going to, influence
It'll
the kind of
determine
choices
that,
that you make, right? It's that like, unless you're going to a major SEG or some major event that's like getting a bunch of people to travel and converge all in one space, where you need to be a little bit broader, because you're going to face a wider
Because
swath
then
of
things
decks.
coalesce.
Right, yeah, you're going to
Yeah.
find a much wider swath of decks as opposed to what you would do at your local or whatever. But like, not getting married to whatever adaptations you make. I mean, granted, like I don't have a good winning record, but if anybody who follows me on my Mox field, you'll see I make changes like every single goddamn week. Like I am always trying different things, because but like I'm not just trying things for the hell of it. I'm not being like, oh, I haven't tried this in a while, let me maybe give it a shot. Every single time I have a thing that I'm thinking about, whether or not it's going to be effective or not, my thought process behind it, my choices behind it are not random. I'm thinking like,
Yeah.
this tool is to combat this axis that I expect to face, and then hopefully that lines up, and I can rack up a couple W's. But like, I urge that to everybody else who, like, if you're getting frustrated, the way to like not get frustrated is to not attach your expectations to results that don't happen, if you're not thinking like, what does that actually look like beyond this one event.
Well, I mean, that's a perfect example of what happened with me. I went 1-1-1 against Scam, but I walked away with knowledge, right? Like I and I'm not attaching my success or lack thereof success to what I learned. And I think that's the important thing is to right now I'm sharing the insights I picked up that I think will help me in the future to win against that deck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Uh,
I think that like it is really nice that you like came upon a deck that you own, that you have reps with, that you're getting more practice in, but also happens to have a bunch of tools that line up really well on the axes that you need to contend with the best deck, and then just shifting a couple numbers around so you're a bit more redundant. The 8cast curve is already super low, but it's like, yeah, maybe you move away from the size and you move more towards patchwork automatons or whatever it is to lower the curve as a concession there. And then you're like, yep, I'm going to play additional unlicensed Hearthstone on top of my Emeries and on top of my Chalices as ways to fight the graveyard axis against Scam. And now it's like, oh, well, now I'm set up to do really well against two axes. Now I just have to hope that, I just don't get like the unlucky die rolls plus unbeatable hands.
Yeah. I'm gonna leave you with this. First off, Phil, we're all gonna miss you until the 18th of May. But to put a punctuation onto this episode and give it a wrestling theme, to be the man, you've got to beat the man.
I will miss everybody. I hope that you have a wonderful time. Zach, I have a really gut wrenching feeling that's going to happen. I imagine that when I'm gone, we're just going to have the best performing episodes, and that's just going to be like, what was the variable that changed? Okay, so crossing my fingers that. So I want that. I both want that to happen, and then for my own sake, for it to not happen. But it'd be better if it did happen. So it's conflicting.
I couldn't do this show without you, man.
Conflicting.
You're not getting fired.
Conflicting.
All right. Well, with that said, thank you everybody for watching. We want to thank our sponsors, Moxfield and Tales of Adventure. You can use code DURTLES at Tales of Adventure for 5% off. And if you want to become a Dirtle Maniac and help support the show, especially while Phil is gone, you can go to patreon.com/eternaldurtles and support the show. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you next time. For the gift that keeps on giving all year round, join our Patreon at patreon.com/eternaldurtles. And hey, check out this playlist we got up here with all of our interviews over the last couple of years. Some great people from the Legacy community, some really great guests.